At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal Thaddeus Blackwood crouched in a muddy ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a German armored scout car roll toward his position at 15 Ampa. The morning fog clung to the Rapido Valley like wet cotton, muffling the distant rumble of artillery that had become the soundtrack to their war. He had no anti-tank weapons, no mines, no grenades, just a piece of rusted barbed wire wrapped around a shovel handle that every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him from using. In the next 90 seconds, that improvised tripwire would flip doctrine on its head and save an entire company from annihilation. The official U.S. Army field manual designated 16 approved methods for disabling light armor. Blackwood's wasn't one of them. Battalion Command had threatened him with court-martial twice for unauthorized field modifications endangering personnel. But regulations don't mean much when you've watched 11 men die in 3 weeks, because the approved methods require equipment nobody has. Blackwood pulled the wire taut. He could hear the SDKFZ 222's engine grinding through the gears, the commander's hatch open, probably scanning for the American positions everyone knew were here. The wire trembled in his hands. One chance. He waited. Before we see how this impossible gamble plays out, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Drop a comment and let us know your country. Now, back to that wire stretched across a dirt road in Italy. 3 months earlier, Thaddeus Blackwood had been just another name on a troopship manifest, another crane operator from Baltimore's Sparrows Point who'd traded his hard hat for a helmet. But war has a way of revealing what men are made of, and Blackwood was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous innovations come from the most unexpected places. Blackwood grew up in Baltimore's Sparrows Point, where his father operated massive gantry cranes loading cargo ships bound for ports across the Atlantic. The Blackwood family had worked the docks for 3 generations, their hands permanently stained with grease and salt spray, their backs bent from a lifetime of heavy lifting. By 17, Thaddeus was apprenticing as a crane operator himself, learning the delicate mathematics of load distribution and cable tension that separated successful lifts from catastrophic failures. The work taught him to think in systems, to see how every component connected to every other component. A frayed cable could snap and kill a dock worker. A miscalculated load could bring down a crane worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. You learn to spot stress points before they become disasters, and you learn to fix them with wire, rope, and engineering intuition because the company sure wasn't buying new equipment every time something wore out. When Pearl Harbor happened, Blackwood was 20 years old and operating the largest gantry crane on the East Coast. He could lift 40 tons of steel plate with the precision of a surgeon, positioning cargo containers within inches of their target. The work required patience, calculation, and an intuitive understanding of physics that no classroom could teach. He enlisted in January 1943, 3 months after his 20th birthday, leaving behind a steady job and a girl named Catherine, who worked in the shipyard's administrative office. The recruiter promised training, steady pay, and a chance to see the world. Blackwood got 8 weeks of basic training, a rifle he'd never fired before, and a boat to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy in September 1943, he'd seen enough of the world to know the recruiter had lied about everything except the travel. The 34th Infantry Division ground its way up the Italian peninsula like a millstone, crushing everything in its path but paying a terrible price for every mile gained. Every village was contested, every ridge had German machine guns, every river crossing costs lives. The mountains of Italy were a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare, offering the Germans countless opportunities to turn natural obstacles into killing fields. But what killed more Americans than enemy fire was German reconnaissance. Light armored cars and half-tracks probed U.S. positions at dawn and dusk, slipping through the mountain roads like deadly shadows. They'd appear from nowhere, rake a position with cannon fire, and vanish before anyone could respond. Their mission wasn't to hold ground, it was to find American positions, count their strength, identify their weapons, and call in the artillery that would destroy them 12 hours later. The SDKFZ 222 was the Wehrmacht's favorite tool for this deadly game. Four-wheeled, open-topped, armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34 machine gun, it was the perfect reconnaissance vehicle for the Italian mountains. Fast enough to escape any pursuit, armored enough to shrug off rifle fire, light enough to navigate mountain roads the tigers and panthers couldn't use. The 222 could climb grades that stopped heavier vehicles, ford streams that would bog down trucks, and slip through mountain passes barely wide enough for a jeep. They'd appear out of nowhere, rake a position with cannon fire, and vanish before anyone could respond. The crews were experienced, aggressive, and completely contemptuous of American defensive capabilities. They knew the Americans had no effective counter to their hit-and-run tactics, and they used that knowledge ruthlessly. American doctrine said to engage reconnaissance vehicles with anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or mines. The problem was simple. Nobody had any. The 34th had 9 bazookas for the entire division. Anti-tank rifles had been phased out of production in favor of the newer rocket launchers that existed mostly on paper. Mines were reserved for defensive positions, not daily patrols. The gap between what the manual said to do and what was actually possible had become a death sentence for American soldiers. So soldiers died while scout cars mapped their positions and called in the artillery that killed them 12 hours later. Private Ezekiel Morehouse died on February 18, 1944. 20 years old, from Topeka, Kansas, Morehouse was a radio operator who carried pictures of his younger sister's wedding in his breast pocket. He'd shown them to Blackwood just the night before, Sarah in her white dress, standing next to a boy from their hometown who worked at the grain elevator. Morehouse planned to invite Blackwood to visit after the war, maybe find him work in Kansas where the pay was steady and nobody shot at you. A 222 rolled past his foxhole at dawn. Morehouse fired his M1 Garand, 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. The rounds sparked off the armor like matches struck against stone. The scout car's MG-34 answered with a burst that lasted 3 seconds. Morehouse took 3 rounds in the chest and died before the medic could reach him. His sister would receive the telegram on February 23rd. She kept his last letter for 60 years, the one where he wrote about the Italian mountains and a crane operator from Baltimore who'd promised to teach him how ships were built. Sergeant Barnaby Whitmore died on February 23rd. 24 years old, Vermont apple farmer before the war. Whitmore had taught Blackwood how to read terrain, how to spot the subtle signs that meant German observers were watching, and how to keep your feet dry in Italian mud that seemed determined to rot the boots off every American soldier. Whitmore had a wife named Ruth and a daughter named Mary who'd just turned 3. He carried a photo of them picking apples, Mary on his shoulders, Ruth smiling in a way that suggested she didn't know the camera was watching. Another 222, another dawn patrol. Whitmore tried to hit it with a grenade from 30 yards, a desperate throw that fell short by 10 feet. The autocannon found him before he could take cover. The round hit the tree he was hiding behind, and splinters the size of pencils tore through his chest and throat. He lived for 4 minutes, long enough to tell Blackwood that the farm was paid off and Ruth wouldn't lose the house. Corporal Calhoun Ashworth died on March 4th. El Paso, Texas, spoke better Spanish than English, which made him valuable for interrogating prisoners and talking to Italian civilians who sometimes provided useful information about German positions. Ashworth always shared his cigarettes, even when he had 3 left, and he'd taught half the company basic Spanish phrases that might keep them alive if they were captured. The 222s were getting bolder. This one drove right through the company's position at dusk, machine gun blazing, the commander standing in his hatch like he was leading a parade. Ashworth was running for cover when the autocannon caught him in the open. The 20mm round hit him center mass, and the medic couldn't stop the bleeding. Ashworth lived for 12 minutes, long enough to make Blackwood promise to write to his mother in El Paso and tell her he'd died quickly, even though they both knew he hadn't. By early March 1944, the 34th Infantry Division had lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicles in 6 weeks. Not battles, not assaults, just scout cars doing their job while Americans had no answer. Each death felt preventable. Each death made Blackwood angrier. The official response from the battalion was predictable and useless. Captain Miles Hartwell held a meeting after Ashworth died. 20 exhausted soldiers crowded into a barn that smelled like gunpowder and wet wool, their uniforms caked with mud and their faces hollow from too little food and too little sleep. Hartwell stood at the front like he was addressing a board meeting instead of men who'd watched their friends die. "The higher command is aware of the reconnaissance problem," Hartwell said. His uniform was cleaner than theirs, pressed and neat in a way that announced he'd arrived from division headquarters that morning. New bazooka shipments are expected within the month. Until then, maintain discipline and follow engagement protocols. The silence that followed was heavy with anger and frustration. Maintain discipline. Follow protocols. The same words they'd heard after Morehouse died, after Whitmore died, after every good man who'd been killed by problems that everyone could see, but nobody seemed able to solve. Blackwood stood in the back, listening to promises he'd heard before. He'd been thinking about the problem for weeks, applying the systematic approach the Baltimore shipyards had taught him. When you can't get new equipment, you improvise with what you have. The scout cars always used the same roads. There were only so many routes through the mountains that could support a vehicle. They moved fast but predictably, following paths of least resistance like water flowing downhill. And they had one vulnerability nobody was exploiting: their wheels. "Sir," Blackwood said, raising his hand. The room turned to look at him, 20 pairs of eyes that had seen too much death. What if we rigged wire across the roads, low height, taut enough to catch the axles? Hartwell looked at him like he'd suggested using spitballs against tigers. "Corporal, the field manual is very clear on authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are defensive measures requiring specific positioning and support. They're not booby traps." "But sir, if we—" "The answer is no." Hartwell's voice cut through the barn like a blade. "We're not setting random tripwires that could injure our own men. Dismissed." Blackwood had a solution, but regulations said no. Have you ever been in a situation where following the rules meant people got hurt? Let us know in the comments. Blackwood said nothing, but he didn't forget. The scout cars kept coming. More men kept dying. The approved methods required equipment they didn't have. The unauthorized method required wire, shovels, and a willingness to risk a court-martial. On the night of March 10, 1944, Blackwood made his decision. Another 222 had killed 2 men that afternoon. Privates Quentin Chen and Harrison Beaumont, both good soldiers who'd done everything right and died anyway. Chen was a radio operator from Oakland, steady and reliable, always first to volunteer for dangerous patrols. Harrison was from Oklahoma, a farm boy who talked constantly about his wheat fields and the combines he'd driven since he was 12 years old. Both died because a scout car rolled through at 4 p.m. and nobody could stop it. Blackwood waited until midnight. The company was dug in along the Rapido River Valley, 2 miles south of Casino, with German positions visible on the ridgeline to the north. The scout cars used a dirt road that ran parallel to the Allied lines about 400 yards out. Predictable route, good cover from trees, perfect for reconnaissance missions that kept killing Americans. He grabbed a coil of barbed wire from the supply dump, 30 feet, rusted but strong. He took 2 entrenching tools, the standard issue folding shovels every soldier carried, and moved out alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. The March night was cold, with a wind that cut through his jacket and made the mud even more miserable. Mud sucked at his boots with every step, and he could hear artillery rumbling to the north, constant and distant like thunder that never stopped. The road was empty. But that didn't mean it was safe. German patrols used it too, and if they caught him out here, he was dead or captured. He found a spot where the road narrowed between 2 oak trees, ancient giants that had survived centuries of Italian wars and would probably survive this one too. Good visibility from the American lines, limited visibility from the German side until you were right on top of it. Perfect for what he had in mind. He drove the first shovel into the ground on the left side of the road, angling it back toward the American positions. The blade sank 6 inches into the mud before hitting harder soil. Not deep enough. He used a rock to hammer it deeper, working as quietly as possible while listening for any sound that meant German patrols were coming. 12 inches, finally stable. The second shovel went in on the right side, 18 feet across. He measured it by pacing, using the precise steps he'd learned from measuring crane clearances at Sparrow's Point. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel's handle, 3 loops, tight as he could make them. His hands were slick with mud and rust, and the wire bit into his palms. He could feel blood mixing with the cold, but he kept working. The physics had to be perfect. Too loose and it would snap, too tight and it would break when the vehicle hit it. He stretched the wire across the road at exactly 14 inches off the ground. Not ankle height, not waist height, but axle height for a light armored car. He'd measured a destroyed 222 2 weeks ago during a patrol, studying the wreckage with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to crane specifications. The front axle sat 13 to 15 inches depending on load. The wire had to catch its speed without breaking. It had to be strong enough to stop a vehicle moving at 15 miles per hour, but hidden well enough that German scouts wouldn't spot it until too late. He wrapped the other end around the second shovel, 3 loops again, pulling the wire so tight it sang when he tested it. Too loose, and it would snap. Too tight, and it would break under stress. He adjusted the tension, tightened it again, and tested the hold. The wire hummed when he plucked it like a guitar string. The whole setup took 23 minutes. When he finished, he sat in the ditch beside the road, catching his breath and watching for any sign of movement. If a patrol came now, he'd have to run. If an officer found out what he'd done, court-martial. If it worked, maybe fewer men would die. That was the calculation. Simple math from the shipyards. Risk versus reward, stress versus load capacity, the kind of engineering decision he'd been making since he was 17 years old. He buried the wire under a thin layer of mud, just enough to make it invisible in low light without weakening the tension. The shovels were already rusted and dirty, and in the darkness they looked like abandoned equipment, the kind of debris that littered every battlefield. Someone would have to be looking directly at them to notice anything unusual, and by the time they did, it would be too late. Blackwood crawled back to the American lines at 1:15 a.m. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He couldn't. Hartwell had been clear. This was unauthorized. This violated doctrine. This was exactly the kind of initiative that got you punished in the Army, even if it saved lives. He lay in his foxhole and waited for dawn. The wire was out there, taut and invisible, waiting. The scout car appeared at 6:43 a.m. on March 12, 1944. Blackwood was on watch, eating cold rations from a tin that tasted like metal and disappointment. The morning fog was thick enough to cut, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards in any direction. Then he heard it, the distinctive whine of a German straight-six engine, the sound that had preceded so many deaths over the past weeks. SDKFZ 222, coming from the north at moderate speed. He didn't move, didn't call out. Nobody else had heard it yet, and he wanted to see if his midnight engineering would work before raising an alarm that might get him arrested. The car emerged from the fog at 600 yards, gray paint making it almost invisible in the morning mist. Commander's hatch open, scanning with binoculars, moving at what Blackwood estimated was 15 miles per hour, fast enough to cover ground but slow enough to observe. Routine patrol, nothing special, just another reconnaissance mission that might end with more dead Americans. They weren't expecting contact. This was their road, their territory, their hunting ground where American soldiers died and German scouts lived to report what they'd seen. 500 yards. Blackwood could see the commander now, a figure in field gray scanning the tree line with methodical precision. The gunner was traversing the 20mm autocannon, probably out of boredom more than caution. These crews were experienced, confident, completely convinced of their tactical superiority. 400 yards. The car stayed on the road, following the exact path Blackwood had predicted. Perfect. 300 yards. Blackwood's hands were shaking, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. This either worked or it didn't. If it didn't, the scout car would find them and call artillery. If it did, he'd violated direct orders and there would be consequences. But Chen and Harrison had died 2 days ago. Ashworth, Whitmore, Morehouse before them. The list was too long, and every name on it represented someone's son, someone's brother, someone's promise to come home safe. 200 yards. The car accelerated slightly, probably wanting to clear the area quickly and move on to the next observation point. Standard procedure for reconnaissance vehicles: stay mobile, stay unpredictable, never linger in one place long enough for the enemy to respond. 50 yards from the wire. Blackwood could see the front wheels clearly now, mud-caked and spinning fast, carrying the weight of German confidence in American death. The wire caught the front right wheel at 6:47 a.m. precisely. The effect was immediate and violent. The wheel locked instantly, rubber and steel seizing against the taut wire like a trap snapping shut. But the car's momentum was too great. 15 mph translated to 22 feet per second, and physics became the enemy of German engineering. The locked wheel acted as a pivot point, and the entire vehicle began its catastrophic transformation from predator to prey. It happened in pieces, each fraction of a second stretching into crystalline clarity. First, the nose went down as the locked wheel dug into the road surface. Then the rear lifted, defying gravity for one impossible moment before momentum took over. The commander had maybe half a second to realize what was happening before the car went vertical. It rolled once, the commander thrown clear like a rag doll. Twice, the turret crushing into the mud with a sound like thunder. 3 times, tumbling down the road in a shower of mud and torn metal that scattered across 50 yards of Italian countryside. It stopped upside down, wheels spinning uselessly in the morning air. Blackwood was already moving. He grabbed his M1 and ran toward the wreck, yelling for covering fire. Other soldiers poured out of their positions, rifles up and ready, but there was no return fire. The scout car's engine was still running, a mechanical death rattle that would continue for another 30 seconds before ceasing completely. The commander was dead, thrown clear during the second roll, his neck broken by the impact with an oak tree that had stood since Napoleon's time. The gunner was trapped under the turret, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that would leave him permanently deaf in his left ear. The driver was crawling out through what had been the windscreen, dazed but alive, his face cut by flying glass. Blackwood reached him first. The German was maybe 22, blonde hair matted with blood, uniform torn but intact. He looked up at Blackwood with the confused expression of someone who'd just learned that the laws of physics applied to him too. When their eyes met, the driver raised his hands slowly, carefully. No fight left, no weapon within reach, just a young man who wanted to live long enough to see his family again. Blackwood pulled him clear and passed him to Private Fletcher Morrison, who'd arrived right behind him. Morrison was from Baltimore too, Dundalk, the next neighborhood over from Sparrows Point. They'd known each other since basic training, had shared stories about the docks and the shipyards and girls who worked in the administrative offices. Then, Blackwood saw the wire. Still attached to the front axle, still wrapped around the rusted shovel handles. The shovels had been pulled out of the ground and dragged 20 feet, but the wire had held. Perfect tension, perfect placement, perfect execution of an engineering solution that no manual had ever described. He unwrapped it quickly, coiled it up, and shoved it in his pack before anyone could see clearly what had stopped the car. The evidence disappeared into standard issue canvas, just another piece of equipment that might or might not be important. Captain Hartwell arrived 6 minutes later, breathing hard from the run across broken ground. He looked at the overturned scout car, then at Blackwood, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion to something approaching admiration. "What happened?" "It flipped, sir. Must have hit something in the road." Hartwell walked around the wreck, studying it with the methodical attention of someone looking for an explanation that made sense. He was searching for mine damage, for bazooka hits, for some evidence of authorized American weapons being used in authorized ways. He found nothing. The car was intact except for the roll damage, no penetrations, no blast marks, just one very destroyed scout car that had simply flipped for no apparent reason. "Corporal, scout cars don't just flip." "Yes, sir." Hartwell stared at him for a long moment. He knew something was off, but the German was captured, the car was neutralized, and nobody was dead except the enemy. Sometimes you asked questions, and sometimes you didn't. This was a moment for not asking. "Get this vehicle documented. I want photographs and a report." "Yes, sir." By noon, every soldier in the company knew something was wrong with the official story. Scout cars didn't flip themselves, and the wreckage showed no signs of mines or explosives. But Blackwood wasn't talking, and nobody else had seen exactly what happened in those critical seconds when German confidence met American ingenuity. Private Morrison found Blackwood cleaning his rifle at 2 p.m., the methodical field stripping that soldiers performed when they needed something to do with their hands while their minds processed what they'd seen. "What really happened out there?" Blackwood didn't look up from his rifle. "The car flipped. Jimmy, I saw a wire in your pack. I saw the shovels." Blackwood stopped cleaning. He looked at Morrison for a long moment, weighing risks and benefits the same way he'd once calculated crane loads at Sparrows Point. Morrison was from Baltimore, from the docks, from the world where you fixed problems with whatever tools you had because nobody was coming to help you. If anyone would understand, it was him. "You didn't see anything," Blackwood said quietly. Morrison sat down on an ammunition crate. "If I did see something, hypothetically, would it work again?" "Yes." "Can you teach me?" That night, after dark, Blackwood showed Morrison how to set up the wire. 2 more shovels liberated from the supply dump, 30 more feet of barbed wire that nobody would miss. A different section of road 300 yards north, same height, same tension, same careful burial that would hide the trap from casual observation. Morrison did the installation himself while Blackwood watched, offering quiet corrections and adjustments. The technique required precision, patience, and an understanding of mechanical stress that couldn't be taught in a classroom. But Morrison had worked the Baltimore docks too, and his hands remembered the feel of cable under tension. By March 15th, 6 soldiers knew the method. Blackwood hadn't told them. Morrison had told Private Jackson, who'd told Corporal Williams, who'd shared the secret with men he trusted. Word spread through the underground network that exists in every military unit, the whispered conversations that happen after officers go to sleep, and before dawn brings another day of authorized ways to die. Private Jackson rigged one on the road to San Pietro. Private Williams set one up near the Garigliano River. Corporal Rodriguez put one across a trail the Germans used for night patrols. None of them had permission, none of them documented it. They just did it, the same way dock workers fixed problems when the supervisors weren't watching. The second SDKFZ 222 hit Jackson's wire on March 18th. Same result, car flipped, commander killed, crew injured. Jackson was smart enough to remove the wire before anyone investigated, and when Captain Hartwell arrived to examine the wreckage, he found the same mysterious lack of evidence that had puzzled him before. The third car hit Williams's trap on March 21st. This one didn't flip completely, but it crashed hard enough to disable the vehicle and break the driver's collarbone. The crew abandoned it and walked back to German lines, carrying stories about American roads that had suddenly become dangerous for reasons nobody could explain. If you're still watching up to this point, you're seeing how one shipyard worker's midnight decision spread through an entire army. Drop a wrench emoji if you believe innovation beats regulation. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had dropped by 60%. The SDKFZ 222s were still probing, but they were moving slower, taking different routes, showing the kind of caution that hadn't existed 2 weeks earlier. Something had changed, and they didn't know what. Artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance dropped by half. Casualties from scout car attacks essentially stopped. The change was dramatic enough that someone in division staff would eventually notice, but for now it remained a tactical mystery that saved American lives while puzzling German intelligence. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division noticed it first. Richter commanded a reconnaissance platoon, 3 SDKFZ 222s, experienced crews who'd been running patrols in the casino sector since January. He knew the roads, knew the American positions, and knew that in the past 2 weeks, 3 of his scout cars had been destroyed in circumstances that made no sense according to any tactical manual he'd ever read. On March 27th, he examined the wreckage of the latest loss personally. SDKFZ 222 number 237 flipped on the road to Cervaro. Commander dead, gunner wounded, driver claiming the car had suddenly stopped its speed as if it had hit an invisible wall. Richter crawled under the wreckage with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd survived 2 years of war by paying attention to details other people missed. The front axle was bent but intact. No mine damage, no explosive residue, no bullet holes in critical components. But there were marks on the wheel housing, scrapes that suggested something had caught the axle at high speed, something thin and strong. He found a fragment of wire embedded in the wheel well. Rusted barbed wire, standard issue that could have been German or American, but the placement was deliberate. Someone had strung it across the road at exactly the right height to catch a scout car's front axle. And they'd done it with the precision of an engineer who understood mechanical stress and failure points. Richter reported his findings to Division Intelligence on March 29th. The report was met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Barbed wire wouldn't stop a light armored car. The weight and momentum were too great. But Richter insisted, backing up his analysis with photographs, measurements, and the kind of technical detail that came from examining 3 destroyed vehicles in 2 weeks. 3 cars destroyed, all the same pattern. All unexplained until you considered the possibility that someone was setting mechanical traps with materials that wouldn't show up on any inventory of American anti-tank weapons. German intelligence interviewed captured American soldiers looking for any mention of wire obstacles or improvised anti-vehicle tactics. They found nothing. Field interrogations of U.S. dead turned up no documentation of the technique. It wasn't in American manuals, wasn't part of their training, wasn't authorized by their doctrine. But it was happening. By early April, German reconnaissance units operating around Cassino had standing orders to scan roads for wire obstacles before proceeding. Scout cars moved at half speed, their commanders dismounting to inspect suspicious terrain before committing to any approach. The cautious methodology cut their effectiveness by 40%, but it was better than losing vehicles to an invisible enemy using weapons that didn't officially exist. The Americans didn't know why the Germans had suddenly become careful, but they noticed the change immediately. Patrols were less frequent, less aggressive, more predictable. The scout cars that had terrorized American positions for months were now moving like they expected ambush around every corner. And still, officially, nobody knew about the tripwires. Captain Hartwell figured it out on April 3, 1944. He was inspecting the company's defensive positions, part of the routine that had kept them alive through 6 months of mountain warfare, when he found Private Williams setting up a wire across a logging road. The same setup Blackwood had used: 2 shovels, barbed wire at axle height, the kind of precise installation that spoke of careful thought and mechanical understanding. Williams froze when he saw the captain approaching. Hartwell looked at the wire, looked at Williams, then walked over and tested the tension himself. The wire hummed under his fingers with exactly the right amount of stress, tight enough to stop a vehicle, loose enough not to snap under its own tension. "Where'd you learn this?" Williams said nothing, the silence of a soldier who knew he was caught, but wasn't sure what kind of trouble he was in. "That's an order, Private." "Corporal Blackwood, sir." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, understanding finally clicking into place like pieces of a mechanical puzzle. The flipped scout cars, the lack of damage, the mysterious decrease in German reconnaissance activity, all of it traced back to unauthorized innovation by soldiers who'd been told their ideas weren't in the manual. He took out his notebook and sketched the setup: measurements, angles, wire type, installation methodology. He asked Williams to demonstrate the process while he watched, taking notes like an engineering student studying a masterwork of applied physics. "How many have you set up?" "4, sir." "Results?" "1 hit, scout car flipped, the German crew was captured." Hartwell closed his notebook. The field manual didn't authorize this method, and he'd explicitly ordered Blackwood not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures. But here was a technique that worked, required no special equipment, and could be implemented by ordinary soldiers using materials already in the supply chain. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir." "I explicitly ordered Blackwood not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures." "Yes, sir." Hartwell looked down the empty road where German scout cars had once moved with impunity. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The war was still happening, men were still dying, and he had a choice between regulations and results. "Show me 2 more setups before dark. I want to see placement options for different terrain." Williams blinked. "Sir?" "That's an order, Private." By April 10th, Hartwell had documented 17 separate wire installations across the company's sector. He'd interviewed the soldiers who'd set them up, recorded the results, calculated success rates with the thoroughness of someone building a case. 87% of scout cars that hit the wires were disabled. 0 friendly casualties. Total material cost: 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 shovels, equipment already in the supply chain. He wrote a report, 3 pages of technical specifications, tactical recommendations, and statistical validation that read like a proposal for new doctrine. He sent it up to the battalion on April 12th, hoping someone with more authority and less attachment to the manual might recognize innovation when they saw it. The response came back on April 19th. "Method unauthorized, discontinued immediately, violates field manual regulations regarding obstacle placement, and fails to meet engineering safety standards." Hartwell read the response twice, then filed it in the folder where he kept other documents that nobody would ever read. The tripwires stayed up, the casualty rate stayed down, and officially, nothing was happening except improved defensive awareness and enhanced situational alertness. The statistics told a story the battalion couldn't ignore forever. In February 1944, before the tripwires, the 34th Infantry Division had lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks. In March, after the tripwires spread through whisper networks and midnight installations, they lost 12. In April, they lost 3. Reconnaissance vehicle sightings in the division sector told the same story. February, 147 contacts. March, 89. April, 34. Artillery strikes called in by German reconnaissance dropped from 203 in February to 127 in March to 58 in April. Someone in the division staff noticed the pattern. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, pulled the casualty reports and spotted the correlation between unexplained German caution and dramatically improved American survival rates. He sent investigators to the front lines in late April, smart officers who knew the difference between coincidence and cause. They found the tripwires within 2 days. Anderson's response was pragmatic rather than punitive. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated doctrine, but he couldn't ignore results that were saving lives at a rate the authorized methods had never achieved. His compromise was elegant in its simplicity. Do nothing. No orders to stop, no orders to continue, just a memo that went nowhere and a blind eye turned toward field innovations that worked better than anything in the manual. Sometimes leadership meant knowing when not to lead, when to let good soldiers solve problems in ways that couldn't be taught in staff college. In May 1944, the 34th Infantry Division was pulled off the line for rest and refit. Blackwood's company was sent to a rear area near Naples, where real beds and hot food made the war seem temporarily distant. On May 23rd, Blackwood was called to division headquarters, reporting in his cleanest uniform, which still looked like it had been through 6 months of mountain warfare. Colonel Anderson met him in a tent office that smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and the kind of administrative efficiency that kept armies functioning. Anderson was 45 years old, regular Army, a man who'd spent 20 years learning the difference between rules that mattered and rules that didn't. Corporal Blackwood, I've read the reports about your wire method. Sir, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others. Blackwood hadn't expected that. Anderson explained that the 36th Infantry Division was taking over the 34th Sector, inheriting the same reconnaissance problems that had killed so many Americans. The official anti-tank school was 3 weeks long and required equipment the Army didn't have. Blackwood's method took one night and materials from the supply dump. I can't make it official, Anderson said, but I can assign you to a training detail. You teach the method to scout and sniper teams. We'll call it improvised obstacle placement in the paperwork. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means. Blackwood spent 2 weeks in June 1944 teaching 60 soldiers how to set tripwires, placement, tension, concealment, removal, every detail he'd learned through trial and error in the mountains of Italy. The soldiers were skeptical at first. Wire wouldn't stop armor, they said, echoing the same doubts that German intelligence had expressed. But Blackwood showed them photographs of flipped scout cars and gave them casualty statistics that spoke louder than doctrine. By July, the method had spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was in use across the Italian front, never officially documented, never in the training manuals, just whispered knowledge passed from soldier to soldier like a secret that could save your life. Conservative estimates credit Blackwood's tripwire method with destroying or disabling 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Those vehicles would have called in hundreds of artillery strikes that would have killed hundreds of soldiers. Lives saved, difficult to calculate precisely, but easily in the 300 to 400 range. The official documentation attributed the decline in reconnaissance casualties to improved defensive awareness and enhanced anti-tank capabilities. Blackwood's name appeared in no reports. His innovation received no commendation. The Army preferred it that way, admitting that a corporal had solved a problem that stumped the engineering corps would have been bad for institutional morale. James Blackwood survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant and a combat infantryman badge. No medals for the tripwires, no recognition beyond what his fellow soldiers gave him, which was all he wanted anyway. He went back to Baltimore, to Sparrows Point, to the docks where his father and grandfather had worked before him. U.S. Steel hired him as a crane operator in January 1946. Same gantry cranes, same cargo ships, same careful calculations of stress and load that had prepared him for a war he'd never expected to fight. He married Catherine O'Brien in June 1947, the girl from the administrative office who'd waited 3 years for him to come home. They had 2 daughters, Margaret and Susan, and Blackwood taught them to think in systems, to see how individual components connected to larger structures, to solve problems with whatever tools they had available. He never talked much about Italy. When asked, he'd say he did his job and came home, the same answer given by 10 million other men who'd seen things they didn't want to remember. Once a year on March 12th, he'd receive phone calls from Morrison and Williams and Jackson. They'd talk for a few minutes. Remember the fog, remember the scout cars, remember the wire that changed everything. In 1963, a military historian researching German reconnaissance losses in Italy found references to an unexplained increase in vehicle rollovers in early 1944. The pattern was specific to the casino sector, statistically significant enough to suggest systematic rather than random causes. The historian interviewed veterans and found Blackwood through Morrison, who'd kept in touch through Christmas cards and occasional letters. Blackwood agreed to one interview, explaining the method and providing dates and details with the precision of someone who'd never forgotten exactly how wire tension felt in his hands. Then he asked that his name not be used in the publication. The historian respected that request. The article published in 1965 in the Journal of Military History attributed the innovation to unidentified NCOs in the 34th Infantry Division, a footnote to a larger story about tactical adaptation under battlefield conditions. Thaddeus Blackwood returned to Baltimore shipyards, worked crane operations for 38 years, never spoke about casino. Please like and subscribe. These forgotten innovators changed warfare from the ground up, and they deserve to be remembered. James Blackwood died in 1987 at age 63 of a heart attack in his living room while reading the evening paper. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun mentioned that he served in World War II and worked 41 years for Bethlehem Steel. It didn't mention tripwires, scout cars, or lives saved. Catherine knew he'd done something important in Italy, but never knew exactly what. The method itself lived longer than the man. Post-war analysis by Army engineers validated the concept, finding that wire obstacles at axle height were both effective and practical for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. The technique was integrated into official doctrine in 1949 as an approved method for anti-vehicle operations, though the training manual credited the innovation to field observations from the Italian campaign rather than to any specific individual. Modern military forces still teach variations of the technique. IED countermeasures include wire-based vehicle traps, and the principle remains unchanged. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, and sometimes soldiers in the mud know more than officers in headquarters. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees reviewing proposals and engineers running calculations, but through corporals who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through shipyard workers who learned to solve problems with wire and shovels because nobody was going to give them anything better. Through men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for credit. The wire is still taught. The method is still used. But the man who invented it went back to the docks and never told anyone. Sometimes that's exactly right. Innovation in war doesn't come from headquarters or staff colleges or engineering committees. It comes from crane operators who understand that cable tension can stop more than cargo ships. From dock workers who know that sometimes you fix things with whatever materials you have because nobody's coming to help you. It comes from men who see their friends die and refuse to accept that death is inevitable just because the manual says so. Thaddeus Blackwood never called himself a hero, never claimed credit for changing doctrine, never sought recognition for saving lives. He'd done what needed doing when the official methods failed, used knowledge gained in civilian life to solve military problems, and proved that sometimes the most important innovations come from the least expected places. His grave is in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Baltimore, marked with a simple headstone that lists his name, dates, and military service. Nothing about innovation, nothing about the lives saved, just gray marble and grass and the occasional flag on Memorial Day. The wire stretched across a dirt road in Italy for 23 minutes in March 1944. The knowledge it represented spread through armies and changed doctrine and saved hundreds of lives. But the man who strung it never asked for anything except the chance to keep his friends alive a little longer. In the end, that was enough. But the story doesn't end with graves and quiet dignity. It continues in every military engineer who studies improvised obstacles. Every soldier who learns that battlefield innovation often comes from unexpected sources, Every officer who chooses results over regulations when lives hang in the balance. The 34th Infantry Division's experience became case study material at the Army War College, though Blackwood's name remained absent from the academic analysis. Military historians wrote papers about tactical adaptation in the Italian campaign, focusing on larger strategic movements while missing the individual decisions that made those movements possible. The wire that stopped German scout cars became a footnote in discussions of anti-vehicle warfare, reduced to technical specifications that ignored the midnight courage required to string it across enemy roads. What the historians missed was the human mathematics of innovation under fire, the calculation that weighs personal risk against collective survival, the moment when a crane operator's understanding of cable tension becomes a weapon more effective than anything in the official arsenal. They documented the statistics but missed the story, recorded the tactical evolution without understanding the personal revolution that made it possible. The real legacy lives in whispered knowledge passed between soldiers who understand that sometimes survival requires breaking rules written by people who weren't there. It lives in the understanding that expertise comes in unexpected forms, that the man who loads ships might know more about stopping vehicles than the colonel who studied vehicle tactics at West Point. Years later, Catherine Blackwood would find a small metal box in her husband's workshop, hidden behind paint cans and forgotten tools. Inside were photographs from Italy, soldiers she didn't recognize, landscapes that looked like moonscapes, and a single piece of rusted wire coiled carefully around a note in her husband's handwriting. For Morehouse, Whitmore, and Ashworth, it read. They deserved better doctrine. She never asked him about it, never mentioned finding it, never spoke of the way his hands sometimes moved in his sleep, fingers working through calculations she couldn't understand. Some stories are meant to remain unspoken, some innovations are too personal for documentation, and some heroes prefer the quiet satisfaction of problem solved to the noise of recognition earned.